G'day, welcome to another episode of the Regenerative Health Podcast. Tonight I'm extremely excited to be sitting down with Dr. Sean O'Mara. Now, Sean is at the forefront of human performance and metabolic health optimization, and he's had an incredibly diverse and rich career that has spanned law enforcement, working as a police officer, working as an emergency physician, and being the treating clinician to US heads of state. So, Sean, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
Yeah, Max, great to be here. And thanks for the invitation and opportunity to come and speak to you and your audience.
So, can you share with us a bit about how you got to where you are now from what sounds like a very interesting starting point in your career?
Sure. So I frequently think about, that particular question, the fortuity that I, as a single human being, could suddenly have the privilege and the opportunity to become so healthy and experience what I call biological optimization is and how that got started. I think it's an interesting story, and it is a bit fortuitous. I mean, I lived pretty much like everybody else growing up, and I went on to medical school, and as I became a conventionally trained emergency medicine physician, was bored out of my mind at the concept of anything that was preventive in nature in medical school and after medical school. So I singularly focused in on my specialty, which was emergency medicine. I was always interested in the most challenging and acutest and greatest emergencies, gunshots, trauma, aortic dissections, things that were, immensely challenging in a very short period of time, and would roll my eyes either visibly or imaginatively in the back of my head at the concept of preventive medicine or trying to get people more healthy. So there, after practicing medicine for about 18 years or so, I happened to meet a patient who came into my hospital, and he told me about losing weight. I was overweight at the time, and I was walking around drinking a gallon of skim milk with chocolate Hershey's powder in it, and I thought was healthy. And I'm trying to lose weight. And he mentioned to me, I asked him how he is so healthy. At the time, I thought he was like 24. He worked out in the hospital gym too. So I would see him in the hospital gym. And he mentioned at the time then that he was paleo and that I should go paleo. And I'd never heard what paleo was. And I began reading about it. But what was interesting to me at that time was I just dot connected. I saw the wisdom and the explanation, and what I read about paleo is immediately of value, and I started doing it. And within, I think, 2 days of doing paleo, I'd written only 2 days. I'd written my best friends from medical school and said that they should do it, and I was shocked when my single email told them to investigate paleo, that they wouldn't do it. And they read about it, but they wouldn't do it. And I thought that was fascinating. And my identical twin brother, who's closer to being like me more than any other human being, he wouldn't do it. But not only would he not do it then, he wouldn't do it for the next 5 years. So 5 years of me exhorting him, and he wouldn't do this. So it's interesting that humans process information differently, get to different conclusions. And it was fortuitous that I met that young man, and also that I went ahead and processed that information. But the end result was, at the time, I was suffering numerous medical conditions. I had clogged arteries, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. I was hypertensive. I had GERD, gastroesophageal reflux, so bad that I had been diagnosed with Barrett's. And by necessity, I had to suffer through and endure a EGD, esophageal gastroduodenoscopy, where they stick a big fiber optic scope down into my esophagus every 3 months. And I did that so much that I did it without any anesthesia, so it would limit the impairment it would provide to my lifestyle. And I had kicked my legs. I had restless leg syndrome. I had obstructive sleep apnea. I had benign prostatic hypertrophy so large and significant that I'd wake up 4 or 5 times a month. And when I would have to urinate, there was no sense that I was evacuating my urine. It was though a small hole had opened up and it was dribbling out. It was just, if you're a male and if you're experiencing that, it's just incredibly you suffer through that. And I also had erectile dysfunction. So numerous medical problems. And within 1 year, all of those problems had either gone completely away or they were substantially better. And I remember experiencing just anger at the fact that a single dietary change, eliminating processed foods and eating paleo, could have such a profound effect on me. So I, at that time, formed an opinion that, or purpose, that I was going to start researching this. I wasn't interested in research at all, but in the absence of my chosen profession, medicine, failing me of being able to come up with solutions to really adequately treat my medical conditions, and the fact that I had experienced such significant improvement, I decided that I'd have to research and figure out how and why that was possible. So I ended up joining a research practice in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And shortly after, being a part of that practice, I think after about a year or two, we decided to apply for a grant from the National Science Foundation. We received funding to be able to research biomarkers that were associated with effective elimination of chronic disease. And we very diligently pursued studying those biomarkers in human beings, focusing on mostly visceral fat. And we scanned about 6,000 different patients, studying them for visceral fat and the impact of elimination of visceral fat on humans. And the conclusion that we came to, and that I continue to have now years down the road, is that no single metric in the existence of humanity will improve somebody more and better than the elimination of visceral fat. Nothing you could point a finger at, study, articulate as a measurement of humanity will improve people more. And so I like to opine about that and share about that particular marker, let people become aware of it, because it's generally woefully underappreciated by humans, and it's not taught in medical school to physicians, nor is it taught in health science classes in schools. And so I want to try to do my part as much as possible to bring awareness of this, because of the enormous impact it has on what I believe is the largest problem facing humanity today, which is chronic disease. So it's really an important point of discussion and a subject that I am passionate about and enjoy speaking about and bringing awareness to through podcasts.
Fantastic. And people are aware of obesity, that people are aware that people look unwell and are overweight. But what specifically is visceral fat, if you were to explain it to someone, and why is it so significant?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I'll give you a fairly short answer of it. It is a collection of fat tissue that resides deep within your abdomen. So because it resides deep in your abdomen and not elsewhere, so it's not underneath your skin, you cannot see or appreciate how much visceral fat you have in you. Now, interestingly, I think our ancestors could detect visceral fat, because as we study visceral fat and its elimination, I became aware of changes that happen within to the human body as visceral fat is removed. So people who have a lot of visceral fat you can see that in their faces. They have an inflamed look to their face, and it probably goes mostly to shape. I can see it in people's faces, the shape of their faces. If you look at the average 60-year-old man or woman and compare their face to when they were 16, probably the biggest change besides the quality of their skin is the shape of their face. And so I walk down shopping malls, which I'm not too fond of doing to begin with, but if I'm out in public and I'm passing people, I'm constantly calculating by their faces how much visceral fat they have present, and then the look goes from their face to their abdomen, and then I can usually see some degree of protuberance. So visceral fat is really an inflammatory substance type of fat that is significantly different from subcutaneous fat, which is just underneath your skin, of which most people are aware of. It's kind of pinch an inch of fat that's underneath your skin. It's the kind of thing that you may have rolls of fat. You're aware of it, but you could have an immense amount of subcutaneous fat max, and a very small amount of visceral fat, and or none at all, and you would be significantly more healthy than somebody who has a lot of visceral fat. So in my study, I see people just the opposite. I see people who have very little subcutaneous fat and end up having a lot of visceral fat. And so these are people that we call TOFIs, thin outside, fat inside. Thin outside, fat inside, TOFIs. But what's interesting about these TOFIs is, one, they seem to gravitate towards me as clients. And I think it's because I end up by virtue of the questions I ask people when I work, because I have so little time, I can't take care of everybody who wants to work with me. I end up self-selecting for these TOFIs because I ask for people, look for people who are motivated and usually driven, so that I can study them better, as opposed to the previous 5 years of studying thousands of people, all comers. I would study everybody, the average person, law enforcement, military, firefighters. And what I found in those people was they just weren't as motivated and committed. So you'd study them and they'd be cheating. They wouldn't sprint. They wouldn't use a sauna. And so consequently, you couldn't get as good as science from them. And then once we identified that there was a type of personality of people who would do these things and would get better, then you could, in a shorter period of time, get better results in your study. So I call these people the alphas. They have kind of an alpha personality. And so we started studying alphas, and alphas for a variety of reasons. I think because they are harder working, they're more driven, they tend to ascend to higher levels of authority, and restless is the head that wears the crown. If you're running an organization, or you're on the top of your particular tribe or clan, you have more stress, and stress tends to accumulate visceral fat. So the majority of my clients who show up, while they're driven and motivated, oftentimes they might look good on the outside. They have a large amount of visceral fat inside. And those who are TOFIs with this visceral fat are at greater risk, which is kind of interesting. It's counterintuitive, than people who are outwardly heavy. So even if you might even be obese, with a large amount of subcutaneous fat, you are metabolically, physiologically healthier than an individual who has very little fat but a lot of visceral fat inside. So visceral fat is a really unusual type of fat that's very harmful because of its inflammatory nature, that it secretes cytokines, adipokines, these active molecules that get released by visceral fat and travel throughout the body, causing destruction and harm to our tissues. So that's why it becomes discernible in your skin, on the face of your shape, literally the shape of your abdomen. Visceral fat is responsible for the weakening of the tissues, your abdominal musculature, which is interesting, your muscles in your abdomen, and really all over your body. But in particular, this is an important point for your audience to listen to, so I'll share it, is the abdomen can no longer, the abdominal musculature and the fascia can no longer do its job of containing the enteric tract. So what that means is the disease process that besets an individual filled with visceral fat ends up influencing and harming those tissues, and you get the proverbial dad bod. So your abdomen is protuberant and sticking out. And if you look at photographs from decades before, we didn't have dad bods walking around. And what's fascinating to me is I figured out as a researcher of visceral fat that protuberant abdomen, Max, exists even in the absence of visceral fat. So this happened to me and myself. I had a dad bod, this huge, it was like a cow's udder. If I laid down on my fours and gave my child, who's now 14, a horsey ride, I would see what looked like, and if I look back between my shoulders towards my legs, what looked like a cow's udder hanging down. It was absolutely horrific. And I couldn't pull the cow's udder up. I mean, it was hanging down like a bag, and I couldn't make it disappear even if I wanted to. So that was a sad state of affairs. And it's really that inflammatory, destructive nature of visceral fat that weakens those tissues. And even once visceral fat is removed, that harm is still present until you heal. Now, I'm happy to report that I have recovered, and my other clients recover from that as well, as they do the necessary lifestyle changes to secure their health. That corrects, and with it, as all your other muscle tissues and the harm that it really is besetting your body from the influence of visceral fat. So, yeah, great question. I think it's important for your audience to be aware. Not all fat is bad. Not all fat is good. But there's some fat that's really destructive. And with regard to good fat, there's brown adipose tissue. We call it brown fat. So some fat is actually a significant benefit to you. And humans ought to be taught about fat from a more enlightened perspective, so that they can begin to make changes and do what is necessary to help secure real, true optimizing health.
Yeah, thank you for such a comprehensive answer, Sean. And I think about it in a way of metabolic health, which is essentially a way of illustrating the same concept. But if someone is metabolically unwell, or they have poor metabolic health or metabolic syndrome, they're basically having too much visceral fat. And the process or the disease that they're suffering from is downstream of the fact that they have this visceral fat accumulating, and, as you mentioned, causing problems with releasing highly inflammatory adipokines, highly inflammatory mediators that is making the body insulin resistant. So the question is why, and you alluded to it briefly, why does visceral fat occur? And you mentioned stress, and you mentioned refined foods. So if someone is, I guess, they're looking down at their dad bod, they've got this protuberance that you just described, and they're wondering where they're at age 40, how they've got to this point. What would you, I guess, point to the factors that contributed to the development of this visceral fat?
Yeah, no, really, really, really good question. So before I get into that, I will share the two characteristics about visceral fat in relationship to its existence, not so much its effect, but its existence, that parallels how much disease one is going to get. So I could, Max, you're much younger than I am, but I could dump an enormous amount of visceral fat into your abdomen, and there would be no effect for a period of time. It would be minimal effect. Or I could do this to even a child. But the longer it stays in there, the more harm it causes. So people tend to view, when I have discussions about visceral fat, that it's really the quantity of visceral fat that you have. But it's not only the quantity, but the length of time for exposure to visceral fat. So you need to think about the influence of visceral fat from not just quantity of visceral fat, but quantity or length of time. So that's an important thing. And so what that means is people can slowly accumulate this and its effect, and they're not aware of it. So throughout your lifetime, you end up getting exposed to bad, harmful food. And in my opinion, the single worst kind of food that you can eat are processed foods. So you can eat carnivore, you can eat vegan, you can eat vegetarian, you can eat pescatarian. But if you are eating processed foods, you're going to cause an enormous amount of damage that accumulates in the form of visceral fat. So how I came to that awareness is, in our research practice, we studied the elimination of processed foods, and it had this dramatic positive benefit in the store of visceral fat, the amount of visceral fat people have. It would quickly abate. And in one particular individual, I remember we could definitively say it was nothing else that eliminated visceral fat other than his elimination of processed foods, because this guy was, I'll describe him as a bit of a curmudgeon. He was set in his ways. He was 68 years old. He was worth in excess of $100 million. And no way could we get this guy to exercise. He just wasn't interested. And so it was a great bit of science that happened by mistake. I was enormously upset at him because I thought he was offending our ability to study the impact of exercise with eliminating processed foods and eating healthy. But point of fact was, he made an enormous contribution in science because he eliminated the confounding effect that exercise has. So he didn't exercise, he just cut out processed foods, and then we did a series of MRI scans on him, and very, very quickly, over the course of 35 weeks, he eliminated the majority of his visceral fat. And it was visually apparent to people who look at the series of MRI scans, and I've mentioned it and shared it on multiple podcasts and have it on my website for people that are particularly interested in it. But it's the things that go to other contributions to visceral fat besides processed foods are stress. So I mentioned that alphas tend to have a lot of stress if they're ahead or top of things, or they're just incredibly competitive. They may have self-induced stress. So the role of cortisol and stress long-term has this very harmful effect on causing, in particular, visceral fat. So biologically, cortisol plays a role to help you in the acute situation, but I don't believe ancestrally it was ever intended or a part of our ancestral existence that we would endure stress for a long period of time. If we were in an area where there wasn't any animals to eat and we were suffering from the stress of not eating, we would move, we would migrate. We were nomadic in nature. We were hunter-gatherers and tended to move around. So we would address that and cure ourselves of stress. Or if we were in an area that was too hostile, I don't know, too many lions, and too many tigers, and too many bears, or whatever, too many hostile other humans, we would migrate away from that to avoid that stress. Today, we tend to have the accumulation of stress that goes undetected or is endured. And it has this enormous problem when we look at visceral fat and its in the contributions that increased visceral fat causes. So stress, processed foods. The third one is alcohol. So individuals who drink a lot of alcohol end up accumulating a lot of visceral fat. And so one of my strategies is to get people to either dramatically cut back on alcohol, and in most cases in virtually every case, I tell my clients that I work with that they would be better off not drinking anything. And quite a few of them have mentioned to me the benefits of Dr. Andrew Huberman's podcast on alcohol, where he, and I agree, very articulately and persuasively makes a case about the harm that comes from drinking alcohol. So if you're listening and you are somebody who wants a little bit of push to get past alcohol and not drinking, I recommend Dr. Huberman's excellent podcast on alcohol. The fourth one is chronic disease. So if you I'm sorry, not chronic disease, but chronic exercise. If you're somebody who does a lot of exercising, particularly in the durational realm, so to distinguish somebody who exercises in a very short, maximally intensive kind of nature of exercise. But if you're a distance runner, a marathoner, ultra marathoner, then we would see, and from studying, a large amount of visceral fat. And I would characterize it this way. It really was kind of a governance that would make the elimination of visceral fat refractory. So if I could get somebody to stop eating processed foods, eliminate stress, stop drinking alcohol, and do other things to improve their health, if they continue to run, doing distance running, the elimination of that visceral fat became much more difficult, and the visceral fat was more enduring. So I recommend to clients to not do any distance running. I know this is going to offend a lot of people in your audience who are distance runners. I will confess that I am a former distance runner. I used to run 75 to 90 minutes every single day. You couldn't keep me from doing it. I enjoyed the endorphins. It was clearly, though at the time I wouldn't admit to it, it was, looking back now, in a clear addiction, in the same way that any other durational form of exercise can become addictive. This includes cross-country skiing or cycling. That's not to say that these things don't have any benefit. I think they do have a positive contribution, but in the aggregate, when this is embraced on too much of our frequent basis, then it causes harm. It causes probably more harm than benefits. And I see much better results in clients who simply convert from distance running to short, intense sprinting. You get more, the production, dramatic production of muscle, and the elimination of visceral fat that just doesn't happen when you are a jogger or a cyclist. So I offer that to your audience to consider doing. And the other thing I point out, besides the effect on visceral fat that chronic exercise, durational exercise has, is just objectively think about the appearance of a master ultra marathoner. They have an emaciated, atrophied, scrawny body. And I'm not trying to be critical of them. I'm simply trying to be scientifically objective. They have accelerated the loss of muscle tissue, muscle mass. This is atrophy, and it's really one of the largest scourge in facing humanity today, sarcopenia. So you are going to battle chronic disease in many fronts, but one of the biggest and most insidious of all is, and it may not kill you as quickly and decisively as, say, a heart attack, but it is nonetheless significantly impairing to your quality of life and could lead you to simply be unable to care for yourself. You can't get up and out of a chair. You are confined to a wheelchair or a hospital bed because of sarcopenia's destructive and insidious influence on your existence, where you lose the capacity to do what you formerly did. So, challenge yourself, if you are a distance runner today, to look at those photographs of those those master athletes, and I see these ultra marathoners in their 20s, and they have very kind of beautiful, strides, and they're super efficient, but they're already emaciated in their 20s, and I'm like, I'm appalled that this is not getting greater attention. So chronic exercise, and then the fifth one is to be aware of is poor sleep. So Dr. David Sinclair does, I think, a great job advocating for sleep awareness and the science behind it, and its role in health, and also he studies longevity and health span, lots of areas that I share an interest with Dr. Sinclair. But if you are not sleeping appropriately, and you have suboptimal sleep, then you will never achieve the level of health that you should otherwise be achieving. And so we would see in individuals with sleep disorders, or oftentimes it may be kind of a lifestyle thing, they're stressed out, and they're not sleeping at night, or they got a new child, a new baby, different things, a new job that's keeping them up, and things like that. It has a very harmful effect on your health, in particular by causing increase in visceral fat. So sleep apnea, untreated, contributes to visceral fat. So many things. The visceral fat could be a far better biomarker for the treatment of efficacious a treatment of so many medical conditions. It's just so disillusioning that more physicians aren't aware of it, to help guide their therapeutic interventions to help people, and really improve the course of humanity. It's just mind-boggling to me that it's not taught in medical school, and equal to the egregious nature of not teaching physicians about visceral fat in light of its destructive contributions to your health, and even life-threatening pathology like heart attacks and strokes and cancer, is the fact that it's not taught to radiologists who stare at it every day. And never report it. So you have what I'm likened to. There are cancers I would rather have than visceral fat. And so you have in these abdominal readings of CTs and MRIs, not one word or mention of visceral fat. And so you can have a CT of your abdomen 5-10 years earlier, it's filled with visceral fat. 5-10 years later, you have a heart attack. And I just find this just so troubling that this is ignored. It's like a polyp within the abdomen is ignored, and it's precancerous, and it's allowed to exist. Visceral fat, not only that polyp might cause cancer, but it is not going to have a contribution to arthritis, to have prostatic hypertrophy, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, degenerative disc disease. I never saw a single form of chronic disease that didn't either go completely away or didn't get better substantially with the removal of visceral fat. It's just it is just that important, and we're ignoring it. So I really like to highlight just the depths of problems that we have in our current system, with a woeful misappreciation and a lack of leveraging or exploiting, addressing this huge problem.
Yeah, and that goes into the next question about how to identify visceral fat. And what I think of when I see someone, especially if they've got weight around the abdomen, is the most basic to the most complicated ways to identify this high risk fat tissue. So you've talked a lot about MRI, and MRI scanning is obviously going to be the gold standard for visualizing visceral fat. But say you have someone who's just showed up to your clinic room, and before you've even put them in the MRI scanner, you've looked at their face. Their nose is perhaps a little bit wider. Their face is puffy. They look insulin resistant. They look metabolically unwell. I think waist circumference and waist to height ratio is a great starting point. What other kind of blood tests or other indicators of metabolic disease do you like to look at?
Well, it's interesting. Prior to my research practice and even finding out about dietary strategies and the story about paleo, I ran a concierge medical practice. So you mentioned I formerly took care of U.S. heads of state. So military physicians take care of the president, and so they're the only physicians that by law, we can use other physicians can, but we serve a formal role as physicians to the president. So I cared for President Clinton, President Bush, and then Vice President Cheney, Secretaries of State. So I had a lot of experience providing executive care. And after I left the military for a short period of time, I had a separation in military service. I'm still in the military to this day, actually, but I returned in the military. But when I left for the first time, I set up a concierge medical practice. I was taking care of 52 ultra high net worth individuals, billionaires. And I could run any lab test and blood study, and I ran gobs and gobs of blood studies. But what I ultimately found is all of that waned in comparison to my experience using a single test, an MRI, to show individuals visceral fat, and then what is also apparent to the discerning eye, atrophy of the muscles. And so if it's almost like we need to revisit and relearn entirely medical imagery to not be looking for disease that we treat, but really to look at it from the perspective of how you can use what's available and discernible inside those MRIs to educate people on how they can live better and need to live better. So the capacity for quantifying visceral fat, and by any other means, such as maybe a DEXA scan or bioimpedance scale, you pale in comparison to allowing a patient to gaze upon the evil internal enemy that's inside of them and allowing them to process it visually. And I think it's just fascinating to me. People really need to grasp and see it. If I gave you a number of how much your visceral fat was in ounces or pounds or kilograms or whatever unit of measure, it just doesn't engage the human mind to action as much as visually processing that visceral fat. So that is the limitation, I think, of laboratory studies, that when they're just reported numbers, and then the patient is reliant upon a third party, a physician, to interpret that. And if you want to act, you need to see, visually process what is wrong and what is good so that you can best change your life. And so the ability to do an MRI offers a patient the ability to interpret that MRI themselves in a far more meaningful way. So I think it really is important to do an MRI, or you can also see it by CT. But I pay a lot of attention to how we lived ancestrally, and I think it's of extreme importance to be aware that humans always improved throughout the course of our existence, probably about 4 million years, in the absence of modern day medicine, laboratory studies, and MRIs. So how is it that humans improved, and now with all this technology we don't? Well, it's probably in the aggregate because we pay attention to things to treat instead of getting better. Ancestrally, we would have detected change in us that either affirmed that we are living correctly, or that we need to make a course adjustment that something is wrong. So, for example, the medicine man or medicine woman in our tribe, or the elders, people who have accumulated the traditions of eating properly may have detected within ourselves that we had started to have a protuberant abdomen, or that our shape of our face was changing, and they would have said, "You are eating too many dates. You are eating too many figs," something along those lines, and we would have made a course correction and an adjustment. Or you need to sleep more, or you need to do these things. You need to do more sprinting. We notice you're not coming out and hunting with us. You're staying back, and you're a campfire dweller. You're hanging out at the campfire rather than going out and doing work. So I have all these kind of analogies that I like to point out to people. But the point of all that is to say that humans acquired a collection of insights about manifestations in terms of how we looked and also how we performed that would have guided our lifestyles. And today, it's all been replaced by laboratory studies, mostly in one: cholesterol. So you could be falling apart in your entire life. You could have an encounter with a physician who will say that your cholesterol is fantastic, you don't need anything, and you are falsely led to believe that there's no need to change your life as long as that cholesterol is low. Or just the opposite, you could look like $1 million. You could be performing your lifestyle and living your life in significantly better than other human beings. Your cholesterol could be elevated, and your physician will become unglued from the tremendous detrimental effect that they seem to feel that elevated cholesterol is. So to answer your questions long-winded, is I'm not much for laboratory studies today. I concentrate on things that go through the human senses that allow for visual processing of how what our state or physiology is. And so what I do think, though, I mean, to your question is, since we didn't have MRIs for 4 million years, I know that they're not necessary, but right now they're the best thing I can think of to show people the influence of visceral fat, and then for them to slowly learn. And I spend a lot of time sharing with my clients what I call key biological indicators, KBIs, I call them for short. And these are the manifestations of visceral fat, such as in the face, the shape and contour of the abdomen and body and musculature. And then the appearance of the skin, your skin turgor, and the existence of telangiectasias, also known by the common person as spider veins. So these little purplish blue veins start manifesting in the skin. And so a child can go through an MRI scan and they'll have visceral fat, but the more visceral fat they have and the longer they have, eventually they'll start to develop spider veins and all these other manifestations. And you can show them to them and to clients, and they'll be reversed as visceral fat is eliminated from the human body. So spider veins and these other manifestations, nail beds, the appearance of modeling or purpling to the fingernails and toenails, how your nail beds look, how your fingernails look, how your hair looks. Is your hair thinning? All of these are manifestations of visceral fat.
Yeah, and that goes to the point that I think, Sean, you're not well known for, which is appearance and performance is the best marker of how well someone's doing or not. And do they appear well, or do they have all these features that Sean's just mentioned? And how are they performing? Are they able to run 100 meters in under 15 seconds, or are they having difficulty getting up from a chair? So I really like that very holistic, practical, real world mental model of health that isn't, I guess, maybe blinkered and focused only on lab tests, or only on I guess artificial paradigms or proxies of health. This is very, very objective and very, very quantifiable. It makes me think, just describing everything that you have, it makes me think, what percentage of people today are truly healthy as per those criteria, and what percentage of our ancestral humans would have been healthy by those criteria. And I mean, I can't think that maybe less than 1% of people walking around today are at the level that their ancestors would have been, or that we kind of evolved. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really good distinction, good point. I think it's probably even less than 1% really are really healthy. And, I think a lot of your audience probably is this, well, I perform pretty well, but their capacity for measuring that performance and being aware of just how healthy they really are oftentimes is colored by their own perspective. So, for instance, your average gym rat will evaluate their performance in the realm of how much weight they can lift, but not whether they could climb a tree or jump through a window. So, a good example of this is I was appalled at looking at the character on the internet, Liver King. He was interesting. I would follow him. But I remember seeing him once jumping up on a rock, trying to crawl across a rock in Central Park in New York City. And I thought he looked horrific. And so people aren't aware, they tend to look at somebody just from the perspective of, how much weight they can lift. But whether you can climb a rope, climb a tree, climb a rock, how fast you can sprint, how many pull-ups you do, all these other things, whether you could do gym rings and whatnot. The diversity and the variety of different functions that you can perform really are best defined as how well you're living. And so we've become really poor at evaluating our quality of life, how well we're doing things. We tend to be myopic, looking at one thing. And so as a consequence of that, I think that that 1% or less of our population today being really healthy is a product of that. And so, and then they look at appearance like, I'll just posit if you're a gym rat and you are working to get the biggest muscles that you can possibly get, it's to me a potential source of body dysmorphism where you are looking at this particular marker and that becomes your objective. And it's on the spectrum of anorexic who thinks that being incredibly lean and thin and maybe emaciated in appearance is the objective that they want to become more skinny, and they're terrified of fat or something. And so what you really want to be is somebody who's not only incredibly functional, but also has a healthy appearance. So more like the character Tarzan. So Tarzan, kind of a svelte, defined musculature and a healthy amount of musculature, but not too much. So kind of like the Goldilocks,
Brad Pitt in Fight Club.
Not too much. Yeah, just right in the middle is what you really want to be. And we need to investigate and learn about what health is from that perspective.
Yeah. And the question I think a lot of listeners are now wanting to have an answer to is, how does Sean treat or remove this visceral fat in patients who are interested and willing to make lifestyle changes?
Yeah. So first, I'll say for anybody who has been listening and is having that question, which I think Max is correct about, that I put a lot of my strategies onto my Instagram, which is at DRSEANOMARA at Dr. Sean O'Mara. And I'm also on Twitter and put out a lot of content on Twitter. And I'm on YouTube and create a lot of content in the form of videos that I discuss these points. But there are a variety of things, and I, of course, have mentioned processed foods. So the elimination of processed foods, the elimination of alcohol, the elimination of stress, the optimization of sleep, improving your sleep as much as possible, and then eliminating chronic exercise and substituting in for chronic exercise maximally intensive exercise. So that the latter one is really an example of a stress hormetic. So when we exercise in a manner that hurts us but does not kill us, that which does not kill you makes you stronger, is really an important leverageable form of optimizing your health that I use. And it leads me to some other additional strategies that are of a stress hormetic nature, such as the use of a dry finish sauna as opposed to a infrared sauna. I prefer dry finish saunas because I think the infrared saunas create an ionizing energy form in the form of infrared, which we would have been exposed to evolutionary, adapted to over 4 million years from the sun, but not from a machine that significantly amplifies and increases the length of those infrared rays so they penetrate too much. So I say that to offer to your audience the guiding principle that I look to nature as the single most ingenious form of influence for optimizing not only humans but all species, and we ought to be paying attention to that. And the fallacious attempts by humans to think that we could ever recreate the sun and create and provide some form of benefit without harm is I think well made in the form of infrared lamps. So these infrared lamps cook meat and food in restaurants or underneath it. And I'm like, I think it's crazy that humans are exposing themselves to that deep penetrating rays that go into tissues that have no biological adaptation. But saunas are an example of a hermetic practice, particularly when it's done correctly, such as dry finish, heat, where you're exposed to just heat as opposed to some other form of energy. Then they're beneficial. And then the corollary, counter-corollary, hermetic is cold immersion, and then exposure to sunshine. One of my favorite molecules in the body, it's the subject of a Nobel Prize, is the discovery of nitric oxide. So nitric oxide is something that I think people need to be aware of, and visually it manifests in your body. Well, I'll say it manifests in your body through four things: stress hormetic activities like from sprinting. High levels of nitric oxide will be released, and from going into a sauna. So when you go into a sauna, you'll increase your nitric oxide. When you go outside into the sunshine, nitric oxide is released and enhanced. And then the fourth big one that I see is from fasting. So when you do particularly extended fasting, you see that. Now, what's interesting about nitric oxide, and I'll point this out to your audience if you're listening, is from the elimination of visceral fat, we saw atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease manifested in the cerebral vasculature of the brain, meaning the arteries of the brain were diseased and clogged. When visceral fat was removed, those arteries opened up. After opening up those arteries, we saw a very profound and incredibly important physical change in humans in the form of the emergence of visible pulses. So what happened was, as those arteries opened up, the adult subjects in our studies, and we're almost always adults, acquired visible pulsations at their arterial sites. So all over my body, my arteries now are visible, and my clients that have been with me long enough to get rid of their visceral fat and open up their arteries, their their arterial pulse sites become visible too. Now, why that's important is you can see the performance, physical performance of blood coursing through those arteries as a manifestation of nice, healthy, soft arteries, as opposed to atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, where those arteries are hard. And I think it's mostly from the contribution of inflammatory fatty infiltrates within the smooth muscle that line and are actually the largest part of the anatomy of vasculature is the smooth muscle. And so as visceral fat, the contributions of visceral fat and what causes visceral fat and visceral fat itself, we see the manifestations of these fatty infiltrates in skeletal muscle, arms and legs and other skeletal muscles that hang within the body. You could see this fatty deposition on MRIs, and I call it human marbling. And I think it's also present in smooth muscles. So when these visible pulses start showing up, it is, in my opinion, and we need to study it more, likely a consequence of eliminating the fatty deposition with those smooth muscles, and then now you see visible pulses. Now, why is that ideal besides the fact that you have healthier vessels and better blood flow? But they become this super cool gauge, Max. It's like I can go out. I get to go out into the sunshine, look at my pulses, just start going, instead of going like this, they go much more significantly, okay? The majority of humans, they go out into the sunshine, they never see that experience of those are the amplitude and magnitude of the effect of this of nitric oxide on those arteries, because they are so diseased. So, I challenge your audience to be excited at the ability to have the extra value of having visible pulsation showing that blood flow is significantly better, and also to help guide your lifestyle. So when I go out in the sunshine and I see my arteries going crazy, I think about all of those idiotic statements from these dermatologists that have us terrified of being out into the sun, of which we have been exposed to for 4 million years, and its existence predated humans for a long period of time, and having us put on gobs of chemicals to suppress the influence of that sunshine, which means that we don't get that nitric oxide production. So it's one of my most valuable features to my body that I'm passionate about and I appreciate so much are these visible pulses. And so these visible pulses really show much better blood flow, and it's through that you get significantly better physiological performance. And it's how I correct, should be obvious to the audience, how erectile dysfunction is corrected through the improvement of better increased perfusion. So visible pulse is one of those cool things I love to talk about.
Yeah, no, and that's such a fascinating point, and I don't think anyone, so few people have actually consciously even seen or thought about looking at their pulses. And it's I looked at mine after I watched one of your videos, and I can, if I fasted particularly after a long fast, they become much more visible. And as you said, in the sunlight or after intense vigorous exercise. The point you made about the intramuscular fat is another very interesting point, and that's something that you'll see as you mentioned, Sean, on MRI. How does that inform your dietary choice? I mean, in terms of eating meat, do you particularly avoid feedlot or grain fed beef, and do you prefer like a leaner or a wild caught venison, say, in terms of your protein source?
Yeah, so I have not been able to concentrate enough on grass-fed beef for its impact on myosteatosis, which is the medical term for fatty infiltration of the skeletal muscle that we can see by MRI. But I will say that I do eat grass-fed beef, and not just grass-fed beef, but grass-finished beef. Animals ruminants, red meat that have been fed a more ancestrally consistent diet, which would not include carbohydrates like greens and other things, antibiotics and craziness that they give animals in the conventional beef industry. So you really want to concentrate on trying to. Our ancestors would have selectively hunted to get the single best animal in the herd because of its capacity for conferring greater nutritional value, but not only that, but greater biological value in terms of the microbiome, which is something we never talked about, that will be vastly superior on the animal that's healthier, is it's vastly superior on the human that is healthier. And so the skin within and fur on that animal that's healthier would have had all the stored microbiome perfectly stored on that animal, and then conference to us when we hunted that. So one interesting manifestation of eating grass-fed beef that I will share with you is, and particularly grass-fed beef that has fat that's really yellow, really golden yellow, so evidencing higher amounts of carotenoids, these interesting vitamin A molecules and nutrients that are stored within the fat are more abundant in an animal that is not fed grains and not fed these other things and fed exclusively really healthy grass. I have noticed, I have scoured the internet, and I don't see this being reported elsewhere. I have noticed that my urine turns a distinct green color. Now, it's not a Kelly green, but it's a light green, and I would say it is way more green than it is yellow. And that happens when I eat grass-fed, pure, really good grass-fed beef. Now, on occasion, I might go with somebody, or with a client, or with a family member or a friend, to an all-you-can-eat churrascaria steak restaurant. And if I eat a bunch of conventional beef, or if I have to travel, sometimes I go into the military and I can't get grass-fed beef, I have to eat conventional beef because it's better to eat that than pizza. So I will eat conventional beef. My beautiful, and I say beautiful because it's a very attractive look to it, green urine goes away and is replaced by the dingy, gross, disgusting yellow look that I see in the urine specimen cups around the hospital and drug testing days in the military, where all the soldiers are walking around their plastic vials of urine. They're distinctly yellow, but mine's green, and it's a really cool thing, and nobody else has that. But yeah, if the audience is listening today, I will hold that out to you as yet another interesting manifestation. And I think it goes to a couple things. One, it may be for sure, I think it's an increased nutritional value of that kind of meat, but I could give that beef to other people. My kids don't have this yet. My other family members who eat the same food that I do don't have this yet. And I think it's because of the capacity to absorb, and your microbiome's role in that is different within me than others. So you could take that same grass-fed beef, put it into somebody else, and they won't make green urine, and it probably goes to their epithelial cells' capacity for absorbing within their those nutrients within the gastrointestinal system, and also the microbiome present within the gastrointestinal system to help with metabolizing, digesting those nutrients into a type of form that are absorbed. So I've noticed too that the length of time of the changes in my urine, such as if I formerly used to eat, I don't do this anymore, but B vitamins, you could see the influence of the color, this kind of artificial yellowing or something that would be present in the urine. Well, I think the speed at which that manifests is an interesting biomarker for the functionality of the epithelial cells. So if you give those B vitamins to older, more diseased people, the onset to which you visibly see that in the urine takes a lot longer, and it's not as dramatic as if you give it to a young, healthy person. They'll be able to manifest that more quickly and also be able to make urine more more quickly. So a child given a cup of water, if you're a parent, pretty soon after that, you don't want to give your kid a drink in the car because they're going to have to stop and pee in a little bit of time. Older people can drink that water, and they don't have that same kind of manifestation. So it's I share that because our biological functionality is something that I don't think we pay enough attention to, and it becomes, I think those are also key biological indicators for how healthy we are, how quickly you make urine, how fast you can see the coloration change in your urine once you consume something, and also just the role of the microbiome and helping to enhance human beings. All these things represent areas that I think deserve and warrant considerable study and consideration to help humans optimize their health and really optimize their lives.
Yeah, I mean, I love it, and it's incredible how many little things, Sean, you've developed, or little indicators or insights into human health that you've observed empirically through your treatment and through your research. And I'm just contrasting it in my mind with the average doctor, the average maybe family physician who is very much in a pharmaceutical pill-based paradigm, and his or her only kind of parameter or insight into your health is perhaps total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and it just makes me think of how far away from the cutting edge someone like you that the majority of physicians are residing. The point of the yellowing of fat is very interesting, and I have a good friend here in Albury, New South Wales, who's a regenerative farmer, Jake Wolke, and he has at various times Jersey cattle, which is dairy beef essentially, and he's using them as part of a breeding program for a very interesting breed of African cattle called Nguni. But basically, when he butchers up one of these Jersey cows, they have a very, very distinct characteristic yellow fat, and the beef tastes amazing. I haven't personally noticed any greening of my urine after eating it, but I'll definitely have to look out for that. But yes, and also consuming liver, particularly, which is very rich in B vitamins, I have noticed yellowing of the urine. So that's a fascinating.
Oh yeah, that's great because that's where I first saw my green urine was really more enhanced following the consumption of liver. And I don't know how you consume your liver, but I consume mine in a raw state. And I think there is some risk to eating raw meat, but there's also some benefits. I think probably for much of our existence ancestrally, we wouldn't have been cooking. We before the discovery of fire, we would have been eating raw meat. But there the cooking nature of meat denatures some of those molecules. So I think liver is, when I consume it in raw form, when I was previously cooking it, I didn't see the green urine, but now eating it in raw form, it must be something, the molecules and nutrients in it become denatured or destroyed through the heating process. So I consume my liver raw.
Yeah, and there is definitely, I guess, a feeling that you get when you eat raw liver. And again, I don't condone it, and I don't suggest anyone source their liver from anything other than the highest quality fresh source. But there is a feeling that you get when you're eating uncooked liver, and it is an amazing feeling of a rush of wellness and health. And I think it's because of the bioavailability of basically everything your body needs to function optimally. Before I let you go, Sean, I really want to get your opinion on your diet, because you have a very unique eating regime, and feasting and fasting regime that is incredibly, I guess, foreign to the overwhelming majority of people. So can you explain what you do? What is your normal routine, and what is the rationale and the effectiveness of it in terms of keeping you free of visceral fat?
Yeah. So really great question. And it is, I think, unique. I don't know anybody else who promotes this, but I do, as part of my strategies to help biologically optimize my clients, advocate very strongly for fasting, which is something we haven't talked about. But I'll just simply say that defense of fasting is because of autophagy and the healing nature and optimizing nature that autophagy brings to human physiology on every single cell in the human body benefits from autophagy. So fasting is something that I recommend, but important to fasting, and a lot of people are hesitant about fasting, particularly if they're in their 50s and 60s, because they think they fear that fasting is going to contribute to sarcopenia and loss of muscle mass. But when you fast, you actually preserve muscle mass. But it's important to follow one particular principle, and that is recovery. So I call that feasting. So ancestrally, we would have caught megafauna. We would have caught some large animal, bison or something, and we wouldn't have just had a steak. We would have eaten that animal nonstop, for the next probably 24 to 48 hours to consume it in its ideal state. I can't imagine any human in the past letting an animal rot and then waiting till it's putrescine and other molecules are causing that animal to not be tasty anymore. We would have eaten a lot. So as a consequence of that, we would have had trained our stomachs to engorge on a huge amount of meat. So there would have been adaptation for large amounts of meat, and in present today, and certain tribes that are kind of more of a meat nature. I think the Hutsa are examples of that. They catch something, they have these big stomachs absorbed where they eat a lot of meat. Is I think an example today that still endures. But I get my clients to stretch their stomachs out. And so I like to give the example. It's almost like you become one of those experts in a hot dog eating contest where you can eat a huge amount of hot dogs. Only this time I'm going to have you eating processed hot dog meat. I'm going to have you eating beautiful golden fat, 100% grass-fed, grass-finished meat. Stretch out your stomach so that your capacity for absorbing meat is enhanced relative to others, and you will recover. And why that's important is you have to replace, and I don't like CICO, calories in, calories out. So I'll simply say you have to replace the lost food that you didn't eat for your preceding period of time for which you fasted. So for instance, if you fasted for 4 days and you normally eat 3 pounds of meat in those 4 days, that's 12 pounds of meat that you're going to have to recover. So you're going to need to recover, let's say for the next 4 days, when you are feasting, you're going to be eating 12 pounds of meat ordinarily, and then an additional 12 pounds on top of that. So we're now talking about, for the next 4 days, 6 pounds of meat that you're going to have to consume. And that well exceeds the capacity of the average human being. So I encourage and exhort my clients to begin a diligent practice of trying to stretch their stomachs out to be able to eat this meat, to not only secure immediate health, but also to stave off this huge scourge that is sarcopenia. So the average 20-year-old can absorb a lot more protein in their gastrointestinal tract relative to the average 60-year-old. So the capacity to place within your gastrointestinal more protein is I think an important strategy to help absorb and get the protein loss that is going to be facing you. So, yeah, I call it feast and fasting. I get my clients to do that, and it's an interesting contrast to the bariatric patient population now that has that capacity and has stretched their stomachs to the point that they can sit down and eat 2 to 3 pizzas or 1 to 2 gallons of ice cream in one sitting. So they have stretched their stomachs out and to the point that they need gastric bypass, where we go in and shrink those stomachs, only because they've never been educated and exhorted along the way to stretch those stomachs out with good, healthy meat. And I wonder what would happen to those same bariatric patients if we could take them, instead of stapling their stomachs closed, and we got them to put in that large stomach good, healthy, golden fat meat, whether they would avert and avoid having to have bariatric surgeries and staplings and all these crazy surgical procedures, simply from filling that enlarged capacity with good, healthy meat.
Yeah, it's the process of cutting out an anatomically normal stomach because of a lifetime of eating food products that are incompatible with normal human physiology. To me, is another one of the puzzling and frustrating and aspects of modern medicine and modern nutrition. And I mean, having been a carnivore for myself for 12 months and still basically eating predominantly um, meat, you can very quickly your body adapts to periods of eating a lot of meat, and then it will shrink down, and you can go very very long periods without eating and not feeling consciously hungry or having any kind of hunger pain or having mood influenced by hunger or satiety signals. So very much in favor for people who are willing to try that. I think it's the health benefits are enormous. Do you have
Could I say
any? Sorry, go on.
yeah, I was going to say one other thing about that is different about the way I eat and the consumption of meat that I think is important is I have noticed that I feel significantly better if I eat meat with concurrently fermented vegetables, fermented foods. So it has become a staple of mine to have my clients chew concomitantly at the same time. They put a piece of meat into their mouth. They put a small piece of fermented food in. So maybe a small portion, a strand of kimchi or sauerkraut or fermented beets or kefir or blue cheese, and they chew that meat with that ferment. And the benefit to that is not so much from a nutritional standpoint, like there's some nutritional value to the kimchi, but rather the microbial value. So the contribution of masticating meat together with these microbes introduces a whole new way of eating lost on the average individual, where good beneficial microbes are incorporated within the oral pharynx into that masticated mass of food that you're chewing in your mouth before they're swallowed into your gastrointestinal tract, which helps sets the correct course of action for digestion and optimizing your digestive process. And the absence of that kind of process means that you have now exposed yourself to limited yourself, I should say, to whatever microbes you have within your mouth. And for the average person, it's a slurry of just pathogenic bad microbes, bad breath, this thick tongue. And if you're listening today, go to your mirror and look at the back of your tongue and your tongue to see if you have a biofilm of probably bad microbes growing on your tongue, which when you eat a piece of meat, if you're a carnivore and you're not eating this way, or you're vegan and you're not eating this way, you're introducing all these bad microbes into your masticated food and swallowing it, setting just the opposite course of action for harmful digestive or certainly suboptimal digestive processes. So in the past, we would have had these beautiful oral pharyngeal mouths that had never been exposed to processed foods, had only been exposed to beautiful, microbes making contributions and living in residence within our gingiva, our teeth, our tongues, our oropharynxes, which would have helped to drive us in the direction of optimizing human nature, of which we have so significantly departed. So the immediate result, what I have noticed in myself and clients who do that, is they're able to consume a lot more meat and feel better as a consequence. I think if you're a serious hot dog eating contestant, if you took the time to add a little bit of fermented foods with it, you'd go to a whole new level, and you'd feel better and you could eat more. So I can eat substantially more meat when I incorporate a little bit of fermented foods, and that also would include natural non-chlorinated water infused with a little bit of organic probiotic apple cider vinegar, getting those microbes from the apple cider vinegar into to help me chew and eat that meat. That's what I'm sipping on rather than regular water. And then fermented dairies and blue cheeses also. So don't want to just have a single jar of kimchi. You don't want a piece of just blue cheese. You want blue cheese. You want sour cream. You want fermented sauerkraut. You want fermented carrots. You want fermented ginger. You want fermented kimchi. You want kvass. You want fermented beets. A variety of these different things, like little teeny tiny garnishes added to your masticated food, swollen, you'll feel significantly better, and it will help you to secure real, true biologically optimizing health.
Yeah, well, I've definitely noticed that pairing acidic foods with when eating meat or acidic liquids really, really helps that digestion. And often I've been recently using organic apple cider vinegar mixed in with water. But at times it's been lemon or lime juice, and or sometimes there's been garnishes with that contain red wine vinegar. And I feel like that ingesting them in between the bites of meat really aids in digestion. But I will definitely have to try the co-mastication of the microbe-rich vegetable matter in with the meat. And look, I think that the best form of inducing or eating vegetable matter should be fermented. I'm not a fan of eating raw or uncooked or unprepared vegetables, because it's my opinion that in our evolutionary past, our ancestors would have always transformed, prepared, or somehow deactivated plant toxins through various processes, rather than just grabbing the leaf from the ground and shoving it in their mouth. And if listeners want to listen to my interview with Anthony Chafee, he gives us a good background and very, very in-depth explanation about why grabbing every random leaf in the forest would not have been a good idea, and still isn't.
Yeah, Dr. Chafee is awesome. He's a source of knowledge and great influence within this particular space. And I too agree. I would never eat any vegetables or fruit that have not been fermented. And I know that is the purists within the carnivore community probably wouldn't eat fermented vegetables or even fermented foods, but it's their concern for the lectins and the oxalates and these other plant toxins that plant defenses that are present within them. And it's not like you're going to eat a bowl of broccoli and die, from one single bowl of broccoli, but it's the insidious contribution of these plant toxins and defenses over a period of time that has a health depriving characteristic or quality to them that ends up causing more harm. But from studies, we see where fermentation is present, and of course it is dependent upon the length of fermentation. You can't just achieve this in a 1 hour fermentation.
Yeah.
But adequate fermentation, we see the elimination of these plant toxins to um, for me to decide to go ahead and incorporate this, and then then I see the significant value when I add them, not so much from a nutritional standpoint, but because of the microbes that are present within it. And there are some carnivores that eat fruit and honey. I don't subscribe to that. One of the things that I noticed when I went on a podcast to somebody that advocates that I decided, they challenged me to be scientific. It's actually Dr. Saladino, who I've great admirer of. He challenged me to give it a try, and so twice I tried nitric oxide. Honey, consumption of honey, and in both cases, my visible pulses that I spoke about that I love so much disappeared. I mean, they just went away. And I started studying and saw that carbohydrates inhibit the production of nitric oxide through nitric oxide synthase. So I'm just not a believer in eating honey. It might be possible to consume honey that's been fermented to reduce the carbohydrates. That's a possibility, but I haven't explored that. But I do consume fruit if it's been adequately fermented, and my metric that I follow on that is to make sure it is no longer sweet tasting. It has the distinct and profound quality of tang that is present when carbohydrates have been fermented. And so I love fermented fruit, but I don't eat fresh fruit.
Mm. Yeah, a couple points. I agree, Sean. I don't advocate for large amounts of consumption of honey. I've personally find that I don't feel good if I've eaten a little bit of honey, and so commonly a little bit of honey turns into a lot of honey, and it simply doesn't make me feel good or anyway health optimized. So I'm going to agree with you and disagree with Dr. Saladino about eating honey. And I think if anyone's got visceral fat, they shouldn't be eating honey. On the point of the microbial co-ingestion of meat, I'm reminded of a story from, I believe it was the American West and one of the Native American tribes. And after they killed a bison, I believe they would have they would cut out a section of intestine still filled with grass, and there's a story about one putting the end of the intestine in one mouth, and the other guy has it in the other mouth. They're both eating like this towards the middle, and they're ingesting all that fermented grass and whatever had been in the gut of the animal they just killed. So yeah, there's definitely some benefit to having or ingesting amounts of bacteria to kind of aid in digestion. And the other point that you really made that I want to add to about the cumulative harm of the plant toxins is adding to the cumulative harm of visceral fat. And that's circling all the way back to the beginning of the podcast. And the point that I want to re-emphasize, because I think that it's so important for the listener, is it's not only the presence of that visceral fat, but the duration that you have it. And if you think about a curve, like that area under the curve is, I guess, maybe a risk. But I'm thinking of a lot of vegetarian and maybe vegans in today's day and age, and not only are they having this accumulative plant toxicity because they're eating so much vegetable matter that is often not always fermented, and they're having the oxalate loading, they're having the lectin loading, the phytates, but they're also eating a lot of carbohydrates and a lot of fruit and a lot of sugar. So they're having those twin evils of visceral fat and plant toxins, and then there's no wonder why they're suffering, and they have the full gamut of symptoms, and they have poor digestion, and they look haggard, and they're nutrient deficient. So yeah, that's a very
that's a good point. I've scanned a few vegans and have noticed, or vegetarians, that they have a large amount of visceral fat, and on those occasions they're always surprised. They don't think they will, and fortunately, they all decided to start adding back in meat when they saw that, because they were deluded into thinking that they were really healthy. But it's interesting to me that present within the vegan community appears to be a tolerance of a change for the harm. They start looking bad and performing bad, and they seem to accept that. And initially, everybody feels better, but when they go vegan, because they've eliminated a lot of times eating processed foods, so that they're probably not eating the pastries and things like that. So they derive some benefit to that, and they may, purpose to exercise more. And so there is some benefit, but long term, decades, 10, 20 years down the road, that is slowly abated, and now they've kind of settled into just a suboptimal existence and putting up with that. It's a very harmful, I think, lifestyle that a lot of people get into when they eliminate this important source of fat. Now, having said that, I marvel at this one guy named Frank Medrano, who's on Instagram, and he appears to be really healthy, and he also functionally is very healthy because he does these intense calisthenics. And Frank is older than I am; he's 63. But one of the, I think, ways he's able to overcome, and he is, I think, mostly vegan, he's able to endure that is, I don't think he's been vegan as long as some of the people who have been for decades. And two, high intensity exercise that he does in these calisthenics. People that do maximally intense exercise like calisthenics and sprinting have dramatic resolution of visceral fat. So I think it's in large part how Frank exercises and rather than how he's eating that allows for that. But he's a kind of an exception, and I like to look at exceptions because there's other ways to learn. And so he, I think, provides an interesting example of how to highlight the importance of maximum intensity exercise as opposed to endurance exercise.
The vast majority of vegans aren't going to be looking like that gentleman. And your sample where you MRI scanned the vegans is probably more representative, especially for those who have done a long-term vegan diet, and that's going to be more revealing of visceral fat. The point I wanted to make as well is that this is just a simple problem of it's a simple equation, because if you're removing animal meat and animal organs, which are such a good source of protein and fat, you're necessarily going to make that up with inferior source of energy, which is carbohydrates, and less bioavailable protein, as well as inferior plant oils, which are rich in linoleic acid, are going to drive this whole metabolic syndrome and drive the development of visceral fat. So I'm mindful of your time, Sean, and I'm really, really grateful for all the wisdom that you've shared. Do you have any final closing thoughts that you want to basically share with us?
Sure. Just that, my own example, what has happened to me and my clients, I hope is provides some credibility to try to encourage your audience to really embrace the optimizing their health, and if they benefit from just some dietary changes, to consider how much more amplifying and beneficial living a healthy life really is and brings to your quality of life, and to try to make that as attractive of a pursuit as I can possibly make it. So I'll just end by saying thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you and your audience. I wish your podcast all the best, and everybody in the audience to optimize their health and their life. And if anybody is interested in learning more about me, they can check me out on my social media presence, which again is at Dr. Sean O'Mara. I also have a website, www.drseanomara.com. That's drshawnamara.com. And I really enjoy this particular space, and good luck to you in your medical career, and stamp out disease.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
Thanks.